Ever been in a relationship where you feel like you're constantly competing for their attention? I thought I'd found the perfect partner in Natalie, but her friendship with Taylor made me question everything. Secrets, late-night texts, canceled plans. It was like I was always a second choice. In the end, I had to make a choice, one that left a lasting silence. Join me as I share the story of how love, loyalty, and trust all collided, and why I walked away. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm 36, a doctor living in Seattle, and for over a year now, I've been dating Natalie. She's smart, decisive, and one of the most driven people I know. We're both doctors, so we share a similar pace of life, long shifts, intense cases, and this constant push for perfection. Right from the start, I thought we made a great team. But looking back now, I wonder if maybe I missed some signs. We met in one of those rare breaks between hospital shifts. I was on my way to grab a coffee when Natalie came through the door, her energy almost lighting up the room. She's a few years younger than me and has this air of quiet confidence, grounded, trustworthy, someone who's been through things and comes out stronger. But she was private too, only sharing bits and pieces about herself, especially at first. I didn't think much of it. I assumed she was just being cautious, considering she'd been single for nearly 7 years before we crossed paths. It felt like she was just getting used to the idea of sharing her life with someone again. Seattle can be pretty gray, so we made it a habit to take small road trips whenever we could. One weekend, we drove to Mount Rainier. We'd packed enough snacks to last a week, and as we climbed the trail, Natalie was laughing and taking in the scenery like a kid. We didn't make it to the summit, but we didn't care. We just sat halfway up, sharing a granola bar, watching the clouds roll in. She had this way of making even the smallest things feel like an adventure. We spent the weekend hiking along the coast, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. At one point, we stopped at this little cafe overlooking the water, and Natalie, for once, wasn't in a hurry. We sat there for hours, just talking about everything: family, dreams, our shared ambition to make a difference in the world. I remember thinking, this is it. This is what it feels like to be on the same page with someone. Even though we spent so much time together, Natalie never shared her past with me. There was one thing I knew about Natalie's past from early on: her best friend, Taylor. She'd talk about Taylor a lot, mentioning little things Taylor had said or done, stories from med school or trips they'd taken together. They'd known each other for almost a decade, and Natalie often said that Taylor was like family. They talked every day, sometimes multiple times a day, and Natalie's face would light up whenever she got a text or a call from her. I always thought Taylor was a guy. It's why I assumed from the way Natalie spoke about her. She never specified, and I never thought to ask. But months into our relationship, I saw a picture of them together, and that's when I realized Taylor was actually a woman. At first, it didn't bother me. Natalie was a private person, and I respected that. But over time, it felt like Taylor was a more constant presence than I'd expected. Natalie would plan entire weekends to spend with her, or even stay over at her place after a long shift. Sometimes, she'd even cancel our plans, saying she needed to be there for Taylor, who'd had a tough day. I tried to keep my insecurities in check. After all, Natalie had been single for years before we met, and Taylor was her best friend. But there were moments that didn't sit right, like when Natalie would avoid taking my calls if she was with Taylor or never share much about what they do together. I began to realize that there was a lot I didn't know. Natalie was careful with her phone, always keeping it close or silent around me. And even though we'd been dating for almost a year, she didn't want to go public with our relationship. She had 1,000 reasons. I'm just not used to sharing my private life yet, she'd say, or I'm still figuring out this new work-life balance. I wanted to believe her, but when I'd see her sharing moments and updates about Taylor on social media while keeping our relationship hidden, it stung. I'd never met Taylor, and I was starting to wonder why. I couldn't shake the feeling that Natalie was hiding something, especially as the secrecy grew. It wasn't just her guardedness about Taylor but her insistence on keeping me out of certain parts of her life. When I'd ask about meeting Taylor or invite her to join us for dinner, Natalie would change the subject or brush it off. "You'll meet her eventually," she'd say, but eventually never came. It was like Taylor was this unseen, untouchable part of her world, and no matter how close I got to Natalie, I'd never quite be close enough. What really made it harder was how openly close she was with Taylor. Taylor wasn't just some friend in her life, she was practically a partner. Natalie would drop everything to be there for her, cancel our plans, even leave in the middle of a date if Taylor needed something. I'd be sitting there mid-conversation, and the second a text from Taylor came through, her focus would shift. I'd watch as she'd type out replies immediately, sometimes laughing at inside jokes I wasn't part of. Meanwhile, I'd wait hours to get a response to a text from her, and sometimes I'd get no reply at all if she was with Taylor. It felt like I was always waiting, playing second to someone I'd never met. I started picking up on things that made me question just how platonic this friendship was. For example, if I happened to call when Natalie was with Taylor, she'd ignore it without a second thought, or she'd send a quick text saying she was busy. I'd get that if it happened once or twice, but it became a pattern. Then there were the overnight trips. They'd go on weekend getaways to places like Portland or Vancouver, always just the two of them. Natalie would talk about the amazing time they had, the restaurants they tried, and the views they saw, but she never offered to include me. When I asked about coming along sometime, she'd brush it off, saying that it was just their thing and they'd been doing these trips for years. I remember one time we were at Pike Place Market on a rare free Saturday morning, enjoying the views and strolling through the shops. We'd picked out some fresh flowers, were sharing a pastry from one of the vendors, and everything felt right for a moment. Then, just as I was getting into a story, her phone pinged. It was Taylor. Within seconds, Natalie was typing away, fully absorbed. I was standing right there, feeling invisible, while she laughed at her phone screen. I asked her about it, just casually, but she brushed it off, saying, "Taylor needs my opinion on something, it's important." What surprised me most was how firm Natalie was about keeping Taylor in her life, no matter how it made me feel. When I asked if we could at least talk about setting some boundaries, she looked at me like I'd suggested something absurd. "Taylor's like family," she said. "You wouldn't ask me to set boundaries with my own sister, would you?" I didn't know how to respond to that because, truthfully, I didn't know how to explain that the dynamic didn't feel like a regular friendship to me. Taylor seemed to occupy this intimate place in Natalie's life, a space I thought we should have shared as a couple. I tried to keep my feelings to myself, not wanting to come across as overly sensitive. But it's hard not to notice when you're constantly put on the back burner. Natalie made it clear that Taylor was non-negotiable. She'd say things like, "Taylor's been there through everything," or "I'm not going to choose between you two." I couldn't help but wonder if she even realized how those words affected me, how small they made me feel. I remember that night so clearly. It was one of those rare evenings when both Natalie and I happened to have the night off. We'd planned a quiet evening and ordered takeout from our favorite Thai place and put on a movie we both liked. It felt great just being able to relax together without the usual rush or interruptions. But then, partway through the movie, Natalie's phone, which she'd left on the coffee table, kept buzzing. At first, I ignored it, but it wouldn't stop, and I couldn't help glancing over. It was Taylor. Every message preview that popped up showed pieces of a conversation that grabbed my attention. Just glancing at the screen, I caught enough to realize they were planning a weekend trip to San Francisco. She hadn't even mentioned it to me, which struck me as odd. A weekend getaway isn't exactly something you keep under wraps, especially after dating for nearly a year. So, I asked her about it, nothing confrontational, just curious, like, "Oh, you're heading to San Francisco?" Her reaction, though, threw me off. She dismissed it so quickly, barely looking up from her phone. "It's just a short trip with an old friend," she said, as if it was no big deal. And that was it. She didn't offer any other details, didn't ask if I'd like to join, didn't seem to think it was something worth sharing. I tried to brush it off, but it was hard to ignore this uneasy feeling that something wasn't quite right. The rest of the night felt different. I sat there, listening to the movie, but my mind was racing. I couldn't help but think about the way Natalie had avoided the topic, almost like she didn't want me to ask more. I kept thinking about how strange it felt that she could be so open with Taylor but so guarded with me. Here we were, sharing a night together, but it felt like I was sharing her with someone else. I felt silly for even thinking that way, but the feeling didn't go away. That night left me questioning everything. I'd been so sure about Natalie, about what we had. But now, for the first time, I started to wonder if I'd been overlooking things, convincing myself that everything was fine when maybe it wasn't. I couldn't help but feel a little foolish for trusting so easily, but at the same time, I didn't know what else to do. We'd been together nearly a year, shared so many moments, and built a relationship that felt real to me. But that night planted a doubt I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to give Natalie her space. After all, I'd been through my own rough patches. My divorce had taken years to recover from, and it had been over a decade since I'd considered a serious relationship. The last thing I wanted was to ruin something good with paranoia and doubt. But then, these small things just kept adding up. For example, her phone was always on silent when we were together. At first, I didn't think much of it, lots of people do that to be polite. But as time went on, I realized it was always that way, and she'd never check it unless I was out of the room. It became impossible not to notice. And while it may sound trivial, the fact that she never posted any photos of us together on social media made me question things. She'd share photos of hikes with friends, her latest dishes from new restaurants, and of course, plenty of shots with Taylor. But with me? Nothing. I started to feel like a secret, like someone she was hiding rather than someone she was proud of. Then there was one night when things finally hit a breaking point. We'd had a small argument, nothing major, just one of those little misunderstandings that happened. But in the heat of the moment, I let it slip that I felt hurt by how she was hiding me. I told her how it felt like she was keeping our relationship in the shadows, and that it was painful to feel like I wasn't someone she was willing to be open about. I tried to explain that I wanted a relationship where both of us were fully present, no secrets, no need for privacy to feel like protection. Finally, I brought up the San Francisco trip. I told her that I'd seen the messages, that I needed to understand what was going on between her and Taylor. For a moment, I thought she'd argue or get defensive, but she just sat there, silent, looking at me with this unreadable expression. It was like she'd been expecting this conversation, waiting for it. After what felt like an eternity, she finally said, "Taylor, it's complicated." She didn't explain further, didn't try to reassure me. Just those words, "It's complicated." I tried to stay calm. I told her, if you're comfortable sharing your life with me, then sharing your phone shouldn't be an issue. But the way she looked at me in response, it was as if I'd accused her of something terrible. I could practically feel this invisible wall going up between us. She became so closed off, so defensive. And that wall? It only made the doubts I'd been trying to bury resurface even stronger. I pushed for honesty, but she sidestepped my questions, brushing them off with vague answers. She just kept emphasizing that Taylor was important to her in ways I wouldn't understand. She told me that if I really cared about her, I'd respect the deep connection they shared. It felt like she was drawing a line in the sand, almost challenging me to either accept it or leave. She even went so far as to say, "Taylor's the one person I can't give up. She's been with me through everything." It was as if she was telling me that no matter how important I thought I was in her life, I'd never hold a place like Taylor did. At that moment, I felt a strange mix of sadness and frustration. Here was a woman I cared about deeply, someone I'd envisioned a future with, but it was clear that she wasn't ready to let me fully into her life. She wasn't going to give up the secretive part of herself, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was only getting half of her, the part she was willing to show. As much as I wanted to make it work, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever truly be a part of her world or if Taylor would always stand between us. After all the doubts and all the vague answers, I decided I couldn't just sit with my suspicions any longer. I needed clarity, even if it meant hearing things I didn't want to. So, after wrestling with the decision for days, I finally hired a private investigator to follow Natalie and Taylor. I never thought I'd come to this point, but my trust in her had worn so thin, I didn't see another way to get answers. The first report came in about a week later, and it was tough to read. The investigator detailed how frequently Natalie and Taylor met up, more than I ever knew about. It wasn't just an occasional coffee or lunch. They'd go out for entire evenings, staying at places until closing. They'd even take weekend trips together, something Natalie had never mentioned to me. What hit hardest was finding out Taylor had been to Natalie's family events, meeting her parents and siblings multiple times, something I'd never been invited to do in our entire year together. The fact that she'd introduced Taylor to her family, but not me, made it painfully clear that Taylor held a deeper place in her life than I did. The more information I received, the worse it got. I learned that Taylor had stayed overnight at Natalie's apartment many times, sometimes back to back. I'd been dating Natalie for a year, and not once had I been allowed that kind of access. Natalie would always say she needed her space, that she valued her independence. I understood that, but realizing she'd allowed Taylor into her private life in ways I hadn't been, made me feel like an outsider, like I was just someone she kept at arm's length. But the biggest shock came in the final report. The investigator uncovered a string of messages between Natalie and Taylor. They'd talked about me, about my place in Natalie's life, but it was more than that. Taylor was discussing plans for Natalie's future wedding, not as a casual friend who'd be happy for her, but as someone who expected to be deeply involved. In one message, Taylor mentioned how she'd want to be Natalie's maid of honor if Natalie and I got married. But there was an added layer of strangeness. She made these remarks about how the three of us would always stay connected, no matter what. It sounded innocent enough, but reading it, I couldn't shake this sense of being an afterthought, as if I was just a piece in a larger arrangement they'd already mapped out. That's when it really hit me. I wasn't the primary person in Natalie's life, and I probably never would be. Taylor had been there before me, and in all the ways that mattered, she'd stay there. It was almost like I was brought in as a placeholder, a front to mask whatever it was they truly shared. I didn't just feel sidelined, I felt like I'd been used, like I was unknowingly part of this secret arrangement between them. Reading those messages, I couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't a simple friendship or even a close bond. It was a life they'd built together, one I was never really a part of. After piecing everything together, I knew what I had to do. I'd been holding on to hope, trying to see past all the unanswered questions and the secrecy, but it was clear now. Natalie's connection with Taylor wasn't something she was willing to let go of, and I wasn't going to stay in a relationship where I always came second. I decided to end it, but I wanted to do it with the same calm that I'd tried to keep throughout all of this. No yelling, no accusations, just an end. I had bought a ring a few months back. I was planning on proposing once she seemed more open to letting me fully into her life. But now, that ring just sat in my pocket as a reminder of what I thought we'd had. So, instead of putting it on her finger, I placed it quietly on her kitchen counter last night. Natalie looked at it, and then at me, her expression flickering between surprise and something else, maybe acceptance. I could tell she knew what the ring meant, what it signified. And maybe, in her own way, she'd known this moment was coming. I didn't launch into a list of grievances or demand explanations. I just told her, simply, that I couldn't keep going like this, caught in a relationship filled with half-truths and secrecy. I told her that I needed someone who could be fully present, open, and that wasn't something I felt she could give. There was a hint of shock in her eyes, but it wasn't as intense as I'd expected. It was almost as if she'd prepared herself for this, or maybe she hadn't thought I'd stick around as long as I had. She said just one thing before I left: "I'm curious what finally made you decide to end it." Her tone was calm, almost clinical, like she was asking out of curiosity, not hurt. That one sentence, more than anything, made me realize that leaving was the right choice. If she couldn't see what had pushed me away, if she was still asking for some final reason, then maybe she'd never really been fully invested in our relationship. I didn't respond, didn't give her the explanation she was looking for. I'd spent months questioning everything, hoping for some clarity from her, and in the end, it felt fitting to leave her with that same sense of unanswered questions. I looked at her one last time, trying to hold back everything I wanted to say, all the frustrations and hurt that had built up. Then I turned and walked out, choosing to leave without a single accusation, without forcing her to admit anything. I knew she'd still have Taylor by her side, but part of me felt that my silence would stay with her. She'd wonder why I hadn't confronted her, why I'd left without trying to make sense of it all. She'd have to face that silence, an unspoken statement that maybe I'd understood more than she realized. I could sense that it would bother her, that she'd never fully be able to shake the question of why I hadn't tried to fix things, or at least demand the truth. In a way, I think my leaving quietly forced her to face the depth of what she'd kept hidden. The silence I left behind wasn't just an absence, it was a choice, a decision to walk away without the closure she'd been controlling all along. Now, she'd be the one left wondering. And maybe, just maybe, that would be a reminder of everything she'd chosen to keep from me. As I walked away, the realization hit me hard. I still cared for Natalie, that much hadn't changed. But sometimes, the hardest choice is the only choice, and I knew deep down that letting go was the best thing I could do for both of us. There was no future for us where I'd always feel like I was in second place. I knew that staying would only mean compromising the trust and honesty I needed in a relationship. I imagined her there, sitting in that familiar kitchen, the ring sitting on the table in front of her. It wasn't a grand gesture, no dramatic confrontation or tears, just a quiet end to what could have been something real. Maybe she'd sit there with a cup of coffee, her eyes drifting out the window, but her mind stuck on that small, lingering question. Did I leave because I'd known all along? Or was it because I'd felt something was missing that she'd never tried to fill? That apartment held so many memories, from late-night takeout dinners to quiet Sunday mornings. I thought of the times we'd shared there, watching movies on her couch, laughing over stories from work. It was strange to think that she'd now sit there alone, probably reliving those same moments, with an entirely different perspective. She'd feel the absence, not just of me, but of everything we could have built together. Her family would probably notice, too. I remembered the stories she'd told me about them, the way she'd laugh when describing her dad's terrible cooking attempts or her mom's love of gardening. She'd taken Taylor to meet them countless times, but never me. And now, they'd notice her quietness, the way she'd drift off mid-conversation, wondering about the silence I'd left behind. Maybe she'd tell them bits and pieces of the story, but I doubted she'd ever reveal the full truth. And then there was Taylor. I wondered if she'd ever really understand what she'd taken from me, from us. Would Natalie tell her what had happened, or would it remain unspoken between them, a quiet understanding of the role she'd played in our ending? I couldn't help but feel that Taylor had become a silent wedge between us, one that Natalie had never wanted to remove. But maybe now, in the quiet moments, Natalie would come to see that she couldn't have it both ways. For me, walking away was the closure I needed. I'd given Natalie every chance to be honest, to be open, but she'd made her choices, just as I'd made mine. Yes, I still had feelings for her, and those wouldn't just disappear overnight. But I felt a sense of peace knowing that I'd done everything I could. I was ready to move forward, to leave behind the shadows of doubt and secrecy that had clouded our relationship. I'd like to believe that my silence would become a kind of answer for her, that maybe, one day, she'd look at that ring and realize that trust is something you can't build on half-truths and secrets. It was her silence that drove me away, and now, in a way, my silence would be what she'd have to live with. It wasn't revenge or bitterness, just a quiet end to something that could have been much more, if only she'd chosen differently. And so, the image of her sitting alone, hand on that ring, staring off into the distance, is where our story truly ends. For Natalie, maybe it will be a reminder of everything she couldn't say, and for me, it's a chance to start again. I know she'll carry that question, wondering if I left because I'd finally seen through the gaps, or if it was something else altogether. In the end, I chose to leave, and perhaps that silence will be the only answer she'll ever have.